Before we begin recounting the events of the following war, if you're someone who enjoys history and the stories of soldiers and battles that changed the world, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the events we cover here. And share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever served in the military, or do you wish you could experience what it's like to serve? Your opinions mean a lot to us and help us build a true community of history enthusiasts. The Second World War was the largest and deadliest conflict in human history. It spanned every continent, claimed tens of millions of lives, and reshaped the world we live in today. But why did it unfold the way it did? Why did the Allies emerge victorious, or perhaps, why did the Axis powers lose? To answer that, we have to go back to the years between the wars. The rise of the Axis. In the 1920s, 6 nations stood as the world's great powers. But 2 of them towered above the rest, true global superpowers, and both would eventually join the Allies. Britain was the center of the world's largest empire. Its navy ruled the seas, protecting trade routes that stretched to every corner of the globe. The United States, meanwhile, was the richest country on Earth, the financial heart of the modern world. But in 1929, everything changed. The Great Depression struck, shattering economies across the planet. In the chaos that followed, both Britain and America turned inward, stepping back from global leadership. Into that vacuum rose new forces, nationalist, militaristic, and dangerous. In Germany and Japan, radical governments came to power, each driven by a vision of empire. They sought to dominate their regions, to seize resources, and to challenge the old order. And crucially, they were willing to go to war to make that vision real. The Allies chose appeasement. Across the democracies of Britain, France, and the United States, the trauma of World War I still lingered. Their leaders were determined to avoid another catastrophe at any cost. America passed laws to ensure it would remain neutral in any future conflict. Britain, under Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, pursued a policy of appeasement, the belief that peace could be secured through negotiation and compromise with dictators. This strategy, once popular, is now remembered as one of history's great miscalculations. At the Imperial War Museum, the Anglo-German declaration signed by Chamberlain and Adolf Hitler still survives, a document born from the 1938 Munich Conference. There, Britain and France allowed Hitler to annex the German-speaking regions of Czechoslovakia, believing this concession would satisfy his ambitions. When Chamberlain returned to London, he famously proclaimed peace for our time. But less than a year later, that promise would crumble. War begins in Asia. Long before war erupted in Europe, the flames of conflict had already ignited in Asia. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, seeking to build an empire across East Asia. Within years, Japan was fighting a full-scale war against China, advancing rapidly, but facing an enemy too vast to conquer. By 1939, Japanese forces were stretched thin and exhausted. During this brutal campaign, Japan's armies committed horrific atrocities against civilians they deemed racially inferior. Over the course of the war, as many as 20 million Chinese civilians would perish, victims of invasion, famine, and massacre. The Nazi expansion in Europe. Meanwhile, in Europe, Adolf Hitler was rebuilding Germany's power. Step by step, he defied the post-war order. First, he reoccupied the Rhineland. Then came the annexation of Austria in 1938, the Anschluss. Next, he seized the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia, claiming it was his final territorial demand. He even signed the Anglo-German declaration promising peace. But it was all a lie. In 1939, Germany invaded and absorbed the rest of Czechoslovakia, a blatant act of aggression that shocked the world. Finally, Britain and France drew a line. They guaranteed Poland's independence, vowing to defend it if attacked. The outbreak of war. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war. Europe was once again engulfed in total war. Then came an unthinkable twist. Just weeks after the invasion, the Soviet Union joined the assault, attacking Poland from the east under a secret pact with Hitler. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact divided Eastern Europe between Nazi Germany and the Communist Soviet Union, two ideological enemies, now temporary partners in conquest. Between 1939 and 1940, the map of Europe was redrawn. The Soviets occupied the Baltic states, parts of Romania and Finland. The Germans, meanwhile, struck west, seizing Denmark and Norway before launching one of the most stunning campaigns in modern warfare. In just 6 weeks, their armored divisions and aircraft crushed France and the Low Countries. The world watched in disbelief. Britain stands alone. By the summer of 1940, Britain stood alone against the Nazi war machine. The evacuation at Dunkirk saved over 300,000 Allied troops, but nearly all their heavy equipment was left behind. To many, it looked like the end. But it was. Britain still had its empire, its dominions, and the unwavering support of governments in exile. Most importantly, it had Winston Churchill, the new Prime Minister, who vowed never to surrender. Protected by the English Channel, the Royal Navy, and the Royal Air Force, Britain held its ground. In the skies above southern England, the RAF fought the Battle of Britain and won. For the first time, Hitler's advance had been stopped. The Axis alliance and hidden weaknesses. Even as Germany triumphed on the continent, cracks were forming beneath the surface. In 1940, Germany, Italy, and Japan formally joined forces as the Axis powers. On paper, it looked like an unstoppable coalition. But each partner had its own ambitions and its own problems. Italy dreamed of rebuilding a Roman Empire in North Africa and the Balkans, but its campaigns stalled in Greece and Egypt. Germany's new European territories were under naval blockade, starved of vital imports. Only its trade with the Soviet Union kept its war machine running. And in Asia, Japan's occupation of French Indochina provoked outrage from the United States. In retaliation, America imposed an oil and steel embargo, soon joined by Britain and the Netherlands. Overnight, Japan lost 94% of its oil imports. It was a crippling blow. Meanwhile, the United States, still officially neutral, was preparing for war. Under the Lend-Lease Act, America began supplying aircraft, ships, food, and raw materials to Britain and its allies, free of charge. This flood of resources began to tilt the balance of power. Germany and Japan both felt the pressure tightening, and soon, both would make desperate, fateful choices that would change the course of the war forever. By 1941, the Axis powers seemed unstoppable. Germany dominated the European continent. Italy had joined the conquest of the Balkans. And Japan continued its expansion across Asia. Yet beneath the surface, the foundations of their empires were beginning to crack. Each Axis nation was bound by ambition, but divided by strategy, geography, and mistrust. Their victories were breathtaking, but their enemies were many, and the storm that was coming would test every nation's resolve. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's greatest gamble. On June 22, 1941, Hitler unleashed the largest invasion in human history. 3 million German soldiers, supported by hundreds of thousands of Axis allies, crossed the Soviet border. Codenamed Operation Barbarossa, it was an ideological crusade, a war of annihilation aimed at destroying communism, enslaving the Slavic peoples, and seizing the vast resources of the East. At first, the campaign was devastatingly effective. Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed in staggering numbers. Entire divisions vanished. Within weeks, German tanks had advanced hundreds of miles, capturing millions of prisoners and pushing deep into Soviet territory. By September, the Wehrmacht had reached the gates of Leningrad in the north, Smolensk in the center, and Kiev in the south. Everywhere, the Red Army was reeling. But the German advance came at a terrible cost. The distances were enormous. The roads were poor, the logistics fragile, and the resistance fiercer than expected. As the summer faded into fall, the invaders began to slow. And then came the Russian winter. The Wehrmacht had prepared for a quick victory, not a prolonged campaign in sub-zero temperatures. Supplies ran out, engines froze, men suffered frostbite in their foxholes. By December 1941, German troops stood just 15 miles from Moscow, but they could go no farther. The Red Army counterattacked, forcing the Germans back. Hitler's lightning war, his blitzkrieg, had failed. The Pacific erupts, Japan strikes at Pearl Harbor. While Hitler's armies froze outside Moscow, Japan faced its own crisis. The American oil embargo had left its navy and air force on borrowed time. Without oil, Japan's empire would collapse within months. The Japanese government saw only one way forward: to strike first. They would seize the oil fields of Southeast Asia and neutralize the only power capable of stopping them: the United States. At dawn on December 7, 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. In just 2 hours, 4 American battleships were sunk or crippled, and more than 2,400 Americans were killed. The next day, the United States declared war on Japan. Within days, Germany and Italy declared war on America in return. The conflict had become truly global. The Axis ascendant. By early 1942, the Axis controlled vast territories. German forces held most of continental Europe. Italy dominated the central Mediterranean. Japan's empire stretched from Burma to the Solomon Islands. From the Atlantic to the Pacific, it appeared the Axis powers might actually win. But those victories came with hidden costs. The more the Axis conquered, the more territory they had to defend. Their resources were stretched to the breaking point. And in the factories and shipyards of America, Britain, and the Soviet Union, a colossal counteroffensive was already taking shape. The turning of the tide, 1942. In the Pacific, the first major blow to Japanese expansion came in June 1942 at the Battle of Midway. Thanks to brilliant code-breaking and courage under fire, the U.S. Navy ambushed Japan's carrier fleet. 4 of Japan's frontline aircraft carriers were destroyed, a loss from which the Imperial Navy would never recover. From that moment on, the balance of power in the Pacific began to shift. Meanwhile, in North Africa, British forces under General Bernard Montgomery were preparing for a decisive stand against the legendary German commander Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. At El Alamein in October 1942, the British Eighth Army launched a massive counterattack. Rommel's Afrika Corps was driven back across the desert, marking the first major Allied victory on land. That same year, the United States landed its first troops in North Africa under Operation Torch. For the first time, American and British forces fought side by side. The cooperation that would define the rest of the war had begun. The Eastern Front burns. In the East, the war had become a nightmare of unimaginable scale. Cities were reduced to rubble. Entire populations were caught between 2 brutal regimes. The Germans advanced toward the Volga River and the city of Stalingrad, a name that would soon echo through history. The battle for Stalingrad began in the summer of 1942 and raged for 6 months. Street by street, building by building, both sides fought with savage determination. By winter, the German Sixth Army was surrounded and trapped inside the city. Hitler forbade them to surrender. In February 1943, after months of starvation and slaughter, what remained of the Sixth Army laid down its arms. It was the most catastrophic defeat in German military history and a turning point in the entire war. Allies regained momentum. The year 1943 marked a dramatic shift. In the Pacific, the U.S. began its island-hopping campaign, capturing key islands one by one, pushing ever closer to Japan. In North Africa, Axis forces surrendered by May. The Allies then invaded Sicily, and by September, landed on the Italian mainland. Mussolini's fascist regime collapsed. Italy switched sides, but German forces quickly occupied the country, turning it into another bloody battlefield. In the east, the Red Army struck back with overwhelming force. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 saw the largest tank battle in history, more than 6,000 armored vehicles clashing across the plains of western Russia. When the smoke cleared, the Germans were in retreat. From that point on, they would never again regain the initiative in the east. By the end of 1943, the Axis powers were still fighting, but the tide of war had turned decisively against them. Their enemies were growing stronger, more coordinated, and more determined than ever before. The final phase of the conflict, the liberation of Europe and the downfall of the Axis, was about to begin. By 1944, the Axis powers were fighting for survival. Their once vast empires were crumbling on every front. In the east, the Soviet Union was driving the Germans back through Ukraine and Belarus. In Italy, Allied forces were pushing slowly north toward Rome. And in the Pacific, American forces were advancing island by island, tightening the noose around Japan. The tide had turned. Now the Allies were preparing for the final assault, the liberation of Europe itself. D-Day, the invasion of Europe. For years, the Allies had planned a return to Western Europe. The invasion would be the largest amphibious assault in history, a massive operation to breach Hitler's Fortress Europe. On June 6, 1944, the plan was set in motion. More than 150,000 Allied troops, British, American, Canadian, and others, landed on the beaches of Normandy, France. Codenamed Operation Overlord, D-Day marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. The landings were brutal. At Omaha Beach, American forces faced fierce resistance, suffering heavy casualties. But by nightfall, the Allies had secured their beachheads. A foothold had been established on the European mainland. Within weeks, hundreds of thousands more troops and tons of supplies poured into France. The Allies broke through German defenses, liberated Paris in August, and began their advance toward Germany's western border. Hitler, refusing to accept defeat, ordered a desperate counterattack through the Ardennes forest in December 1944. The result was the Battle of the Bulge, the largest and bloodiest battle fought by the U.S. Army in World War II. For 6 weeks, American forces held their ground in freezing conditions, eventually repelling the assault. Germany's last reserves were spent. The end was inevitable. The Eastern Front, the red tide rolls west. While the Allies fought their way through France, the Soviet Red Army unleashed a series of massive offensives on the Eastern Front. In 1944, Operation Bagration shattered the German Army Group Center, one of the most devastating defeats in military history. Soviet forces advanced hundreds of miles in a matter of weeks, liberating Minsk, Vilnius, and Warsaw. By early 1945, the Red Army was closing in on Berlin itself. The Eastern Front had become a vast battlefield of fire and destruction. Entire cities were reduced to ruins, and millions were dead. For Germany, it was total collapse. The end in Europe. In the West, Allied forces crossed the Rhine River in March 1945. The Third Reich was disintegrating. Hitler's allies were falling away. Italy had surrendered, Hungary was overrun, and the Balkans were lost. On April 30, 1945, as Soviet troops stormed central Berlin, Adolf Hitler took his own life in his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. Within days, Berlin fell. On May 8, 1945, VE Day, victory in Europe, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. But in the Pacific, the fighting continued. The Pacific War, fire and fury. Even as Germany collapsed, Japan refused to surrender. The U.S. had recaptured the Philippines and seized Iwo Jima and Okinawa, islands that brought American bombers within striking distance of the Japanese mainland. But every battle came at a terrible price. On Okinawa alone, over 200,000 soldiers and civilians died. By mid-1945, Japan's cities were being devastated by American bombing raids. Entire urban centers, Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, were burned to the ground in firestorms that killed hundreds of thousands. Yet Japan's military government vowed to fight to the end. President Harry S. Truman, who had succeeded Franklin D. Roosevelt after his death in April 1945, faced a grim choice: invade Japan at the cost of perhaps 1 million Allied lives, or use a new and terrible weapon: the atomic bomb and Japan's surrender. On August 6, 1945, an American B-29 bomber named Enola Gay dropped the world's first atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. In an instant, tens of thousands of people were killed. 3 days later, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. By the time the fires died, over 200,000 civilians were dead. Faced with total annihilation, Emperor Hirohito broke with his military leaders and announced Japan's surrender. On August 15, 1945, VJ Day, victory over Japan, World War II came to an end. Formal surrender documents were signed aboard the USS Missouri on September 2, 1945. The deadliest conflict in human history was finally over. The aftermath, a new world. The cost was unimaginable. More than 60 million people had perished: soldiers, civilians, men, women, and children. Entire cities lay in ruins. But from that devastation, a new world began to emerge. The United States and the Soviet Union rose as the two superpowers of a new era, rivals locked in what would soon become the Cold War. Germany and Japan were occupied and rebuilt under Allied supervision. The United Nations was created in hopes of preventing another global catastrophe. The Second World War had changed everything: the balance of power, the shape of nations, and the course of history itself. It was a war that showed humanity's capacity for both destruction and courage, for cruelty and for sacrifice. And though it ended in 1945, its legacy still defines our world today.